Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Recently, I bought a book by Dr. John Lennox, who is a professor of mathematics at the University of Oxford, and he, holds a number of emeritus positions in the area of mathematics and philosophy. And he's a very, very strong Christian as well. And his book is titled Against the Flow. The subtitle is The Inspiration of Daniel in an Age of Relativism. And John Lennox is quite a strong Christian. And one of the things that he's arguing is that just as in the Bible, Daniel who became an advisor to Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, when the Babylonian Empire was at its peak. It was the most powerful empire in the sort of the Western civilization area, and it was very much a pagan empire with many gods that they worshipped, and they had many, pagan customs. And so Daniel, as we know from the Bible, was a Hebrew who was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar's army, and he was selected along with other young people, and in particular 3 of his friends, to be taken to Babylon and trained in the ways of Babylonian culture, so that they could then be advisors to the king, or part of the king's advisory service there that he gathered around him. And what Dr. Lennox points out, or Professor Lennox points out, is that here we have Daniel, who knew about God and had a powerful and strong faith in the Creator God. The God had created the heavens and the earth. He was taken to Babylon, and here he was in a culture that was very much opposed to that, was very much a pagan culture. And John Lennox is essentially arguing that Christians today, we're moving into this age of relativism, where there's all these different views about what is right and wrong, and there's the growth of an atheistic view that science has disproved God, and so we're almost sort of like living in a world where God isn't taken into account anymore. One of the aspects that he points out, for example, is that up until relatively recently, certainly in my lifetime, history was taught at universities in the context of God being behind history. In other words, that there was a God, there was a real intervening God who controlled the affairs of men. And of course, this comes out of the very first part of Daniel, where we read in the very first chapter of Daniel, in verse 2, when Daniel is talking about that, points out that God was behind Nebuchadnezzar's victory in capturing Jerusalem. And we read there, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, who was the king of Judah, into his hand. So even though Daniel saw this pagan army comes in and destroys or captures Jerusalem, breaches the wall and captures Jerusalem, Daniel saw that the result was permitted by God, that God was still in control. And Lennox points out that that Daniel is interpreting history in the way that God is in control. But this sort of interpretation today would be very provocative. People, at universities, for example, if you wrote up your thesis along these lines, it's likely to be rejected. But and to assert that there's a God behind history actually flies into, this is right in the face of the secular worldview that, things are random, that God doesn't intervene. And again, if you were, studying history and doing your thesis and trying to write it up from this perspective, it would probably, be laughed at, or you'd be considered naive. And Lennox points this out, that one of the commentators, Leslie Newbigin, says that from Augustine till the 18th century, history in Europe was written in the belief that divine providence was the key to understanding events. And I have a book at home by Herbert Butterfield on Christianity and history, and he points out, and Herbert Butterfield was Professor of History at Oxford in the 1950s, and he looks at the overwhelming evidence that God has been behind the history of the world up until that time. And again, Professor Lennox points out that Herbert Butterfield could readily write of God's providence, and he quotes Butterfield as saying, as God as a living and active agency both in ourselves and in its movement over the length and breadth of history. And that's from Butterfield's book, page 147. So what we have moved into is this age where God is being pushed out of the education system, particularly by this very secular atheistic view. And one of the things that Professor Lennox, who is a very clever mathematician, very logical, points out is that there's an important need now to actually stand against this flow, and particularly those academics and also Christians who are in prominent public positions to actually state their faith, because his argument is, and Lennox's argument in his book is, that the Christian faith is actually based on evidence. It's based on powerful evidence. Now, one of the professors, of course, that challenges this is Richard Dawkins. One of Dawkins' quotes that are often picked up by the media is Dawkins asserts, and I quote Dawkins, "Next time that somebody tells you that something is true, why not say to them what kind of evidence is there for that? And if they can't give you a good answer, I hope that you'll think very carefully before you believe a word that they say." Now, it's very interesting that Lennox actually replies to Dawkins, and I think he raises a very interesting point. So John Lennox, this Christian mathematician, says, "I agree wholeheartedly with Richard Dawkins on this point. Indeed, as the philosopher David Hume pointed out long ago, it is of the very essence of science to proportion belief to evidence." So far, so good. But then Dawkins makes a distinction between the legitimate evidence-based thinking, that is the stock and trade of the scientist, and what he calls religious faith, which belongs, according to Dawkins, to a different category. And because, you see, Dawkins goes on, and Dawkins is, one of the main proponents of evolutionary theory today, and it's been very critical of religion. In fact, he goes on, Dawkins writes, "I think that a case can be made that faith is one of the world's greatest evils, comparable to the smallpox virus, but harder to eradicate. Faith, being belief that isn't based on evidence, is the principal vice of any religion." And so here we have this very prominent zoologists promoting evolution, attacking religion, and saying that people that believe in religion, there's no evidence for their faith and that this is really bad and it needs to be stamped out. And this is something we really need to look at quite carefully, because we need to apply Dawkins' own claim that when somebody tells you something, ask them for the evidence. And it's very interesting that Lennox, who is a Christian, Professor Lennox, Christian mathematician, professor of maths at Oxford University, one of the top universities in the world, he goes on to write, this is Lennox, "It would be a mistake to think that this extreme view is typical. Many atheists are far from happy with its militancy, not to mention its repressive, even totalitarian overtone." So what he's saying is this particular atheistic view that is so critical of religion, wanting to crush religion, saying that religion isn't based on any evidence at all, it's a fairy tale. What here Lennox is pointing out, well, hang on, not all atheists are happy with this. But Lennox then goes on to point out, however, it is these excessive statements that receive the media exposure, with the result that many people are aware of those views and have been affected by them. He then points out it would therefore be folly to ignore them. We must take it seriously. And this is the really sad thing, as Lennox is pointing out, is that the media has taken these extreme views and promote them. But these views aren't true. Religion and our faith in God, our faith in Jesus Christ as the Son of God, our Saviour, is not based on just on something for which there is no evidence. Matter of fact, Lennox, this very logical mathematician, goes on to say, pointing to Dawkins, he says, "From what Dawkins says, it is clear that one of the things that, sadly, has generated Dawkins' hostility to faith in God is his impression that whereas scientific belief is based on publicly checkable evidence, religious faith not only lacks evidence, it is independence from evidence. Its independence from evidence is its joy shouted from the rooftops." In other words, Dawkins takes all religious faith to be blind faith. Here again, Lennox, the logical mathematician, applies and says, however, taking Dawkins' own advice, headlined above, we must ask, what is the evidence that religious faith is not based on evidence? Get that? In other words, we should challenge the atheists in that. What is the evidence that religious faith is not based on evidence? And unfortunately, there are people who, while professing faith in God, take an overtly anti-scientific and obscurantist viewpoint. And what the whole point that Professor Lennox is pointing out is that Christianity is based on evidence, really good evidence. And the fact that Dawkins and these people make these statements that there's no evidence for Christianity, we need to look very carefully at that. Lennox goes on to say, these statements by atheists such as Dawkins and Hitchens and Dennett and so forth do not alter the fact that mainstream Christianity will insist that faith and evidence are inseparable. Indeed, faith is a response to evidence, not a rejoicing in the absence of evidence. The Christian apostle John gives the following explanation for his account, and, with the Gospel of John, because he writes, "These are written so that you may believe." And that's John chapter 20, verse 31. In other words, when John was writing his Gospel, when he wrote that down, he was an eyewitness that Jesus was the Son of God and that Jesus rose from the dead and performed the various miracles that he did during his life. And he wrote that book so that we may believe. In other words, Christianity is based on evidence. And of course, it wasn't just John. There were many other disciples that wrote of the evidence that was there. And that's what we have in the Bible. And that's why the Bible is so important to be read. It's not a book of, myths. It's not a book of... This is an account of recording the evidence that Jesus was the Son of God. Again, the Christianity also, as Christians, we look to the evidence for God in nature. And the evidence for our faith that can be found in nature. The Apostle Paul said that what many pioneers of modern science believe, people like Newton and Maxwell and these sort of people that laid the foundation for modern science and were really strong Bible-reading Christians that believed in God and had an amazing experience there. They believe that nature itself is part of the evidence for the existence of God. As a matter of fact, Paul writes about this. Paul writes in Romans 1:20, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they," those people that don't believe, "are without excuse." And so here we see that the evidence is overwhelming that Christianity is based on evidence. And it's based on very, very strong evidence. Christianity is not a blind faith. The statements that these atheists like Dawkins are making are the very opposite to what the true situation is. In other words, in actual fact, they are blind. And it's quite interesting that Professor John Lennox, a mathematician, points out that Dawkins' statements, again, are evidence of the very statements he claims to abhor, because he says, look, if somebody tells you something, where's the evidence? Dawkins has no evidence that Christianity is blind faith. He hasn't provided any evidence. And, one of the things that's pointed out is that Lennox writes, "An exhibition of breathtaking inconsistency. The evidence is the very thing that Dawkins fails to supply for his claim that faith rejoices in the independence of evidence." And the reason Dawkins fails to provide such evidence is not hard to find, for there is no evidence. And there's so much evidence in the writings of, great theologians and great scientists like Isaac Newton and James Clerk Maxwell that these scholars base their research and their faith on evidence. And this is, this is a very important point to realise, that the Christian faith is based on so much evidence, including the evidence from nature and God's, the things that are created in this world. I was talking to someone just the other day about that, many people just don't realise the complexity of the genetic codes that are responsible for all the different structures of living things, from plants to mushrooms to animals, birds, fish, little creepy crawly insects, and all the tiny little minute creatures that we don't normally encounter because they're so small, and all the little parts these creatures have. The codes for those are so complex, and yet they look nothing like the codes themselves are very independent from the structures. So we write the word apple, A-P-P-L-E, and when we read the code apple in a book, A-P-P-L-E, we can picture in our mind the shape of an apple and maybe its seeds and this sort of thing. And it's a very simple word, but if we hadn't learned French at school and we read the word pomme, P-O-M-M-E, we may not recognise that as being, the word apple. We may think it is something else. And again, though, while we represent an apple with those very simple letters, the codes to make an apple, involve, 750 million chemical structures in the code. 750 million particular letters that we represent as A, C, T and G are arranged to write out the code that an amazing molecular machine, we call a ribosome, with over 300,000 atoms in it, can make once it can read that code and can construct from amino acids and other factors, can begin to construct the components that make up an apple, the apple's reproductive system, these sort of things. And we're just talking about a simple piece of fruit, that falls off a tree. We don't necessarily take much notice of, let alone the tiny little creatures that are around. I was in a museum recently looking through, and there's a photographic exhibition where this photographer had photographed tiny little insects. So we're not down to electron microscope type scale, but very large magnification, 100 times type magnification of tiny little critters, and the amazing structures that are on these little critters and their different reproductive systems and wings and different leg structures and arrangements, different little camouflage mechanisms and colours and patterns. And, many of these creatures, well, they weren't common creatures. They're very little minute creatures, and all of these creatures have a different code, and these codes are extremely complex. They can't arise by chance. And I was talking about someone, to this. The evidence we have now is so overwhelming that life was created. Absolutely impossible for it to evolve. And as mathematicians like John Lennox and many other mathematicians recognise now that these complex structures just can't evolve. And, of course, sometimes the biologists say, what do mathematicians know, or what do chemists know? Well, again, mathematics and chemistry come well before biology. And the laws of mathematics are fixed. They're proven over and over again. And the laws of chemistry, that only certain reactions take place. Other reactions never take place. And, this is the whole principle that we understand of science. There are certain chemical reactions that go. There are certain chemical reactions that don't go. Otherwise, everything could fall to bits at different times, or explode or blow up or whatever. But it doesn't work that way. Things can be very stable, or other things can be very reactive, and hence we can, burn fuels and power our automobiles and so forth, and generate particular chemical reactions to make particular compounds, or to make different alloys of metals and so forth. And James M. Tour, another outstanding chemistry professor, points out that when we read these books and we talk about, and in the biologists talk about how first life appeared, different molecules came together and so forth, James Tour points out, and his job is to assemble and make new molecules. And he was saying that we don't know the chemistry. There's no way that we could construct the molecules to put the molecules together to make just a cell membrane, that is just the outer casing for a cell to form. The chemical reactions that are required to build those structures just don't occur in nature. We can't make them happen. We can't assemble them. And so here we have a scientist, one of the most highly scientist chemists in the world. That means his research is used by other scientists in the world, saying we don't know how to put together these molecules. They don't occur. The reactions that are required to form those structures just don't occur in nature by themselves. And this is something that we need to get across to the young people, that there are claims being made out there by scientists that have qualifications like Dawkins and others, that are making these claims that, life just occurred by itself, that there is no God. The media is picking up on these things and putting this evidence out there or putting these claims out there. But when we look at these claims, there's actually no evidence for them. And at the same time, we have this tendency in the media to look for all the faults it can with religion. And in particularly the Christian faith, that Jesus was God who came here and lived and died in our place so that we could be forgiven and saved. Those claims of the Christian faith are based on evidence, and that evidence is in the Bible. And Lennox, in his book Against the Flow, is pointing out that the book of Daniel, we have so much historical evidence for the book of Daniel, and that the book of Daniel has these prophecies that were fulfilled accurately hundreds of years later, could not have possibly been written after the event, because the book of Daniel prophesies the coming of Christ and his death, and yet we know the book of Daniel must have been written hundreds of years before that event happened. Overwhelming evidence for that. And he points out that we have this evidence that the Bible is true, that God is real. And he is encouraging Christians to stand up now and speak out on this evidence, and stand up and show that as Christians they believe, because that's what Daniel did. Daniel stood for his faith in that pagan kingdom, and he ended up being respected for his faith. And God rewarded his faith with many answers to prayer. And that's the other factor. As we stand up for God, God will honour our faith. And we will see answers to prayer which will provide the evidence for people so that others may believe and come to know God too. Remember, you can re-listen to this and the earlier programs by going to 3abnaustralia.org.au and click on the listen button, and programs like Faith and Science and other really great programs will come up. Just click on those programs and you'll be able to hear the past programs. I'm Dr. John Ashton. You've been listening to Faith and Science. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.